Today we are going to be learning about the plague, which is called the Bubonic Plague, from 1347 to 1352. Causes. The causes of the Bubonic Plague was a bacterium called pestis, which is a rod-shaped bacterium. The bacterium is usually found in rodents, other small animals, and fleas. Pestis are known to spread through the air at large rates and are also transferred from rodents. Spreading. The bacterium of the plague circulates through rodent populations, especially in rats. Infected fleas that are living in the air of the rodents move from rodent to rodent, spreading the disease to one another. When the rodents invade human habitats, the fleas then bite the human, which in turn transfers the bacterium to people. Once a human is infected, it is very easy for that person to infect other humans, because the pestis settle into the lungs of the humans and then are expelled through the air to other humans. Symptoms. The typical symptoms of the plague were fever, headaches, body aches, slurred speech, confusion, and fatigue. A person would usually become ill 2 to 6 days after being infected by the bacterium. When left untreated, the plague-causing bacteria would go into the bloodstream and usually kill the infected person. Where it started. The plague started with an outbreak in China in the 1330s. China was a very important trading nation in those days, and international trade using the Silk Road was what caused the world's pandemic. It was, in fact, the world's first pandemic was the Bubonic Plague. Plague-infected rats on the Chinese merchant ships spread the disease to Western Asia and Europe. In 1347, Italian merchant ships with crew members dying of the plague docked in Sicily, and within days, the disease was spread to the city and the surrounding countryside. And right here we can see that there's a map of the Silk Road in China and of the moving passageway of where it could have spread through the trading area. Areas affected. There were many areas affected by the plague. 1/2 of the European population died from the outbreak between the years of 1348 and 1350. About 25% of villages in Europe were wiped out completely due to the death. Germany was heavily affected, losing about 7,000 people to the plague. Italy was also heavily affected, with just the city of Florence losing 40,000 people. The Middle East was the heaviest affected from the disease. As I said earlier, the Middle East was the heaviest area affected from the Bubonic Plague. The devastation in the Middle East was so bad that the total demographic impact is almost impossible to calculate today. The death rate was the highest in the rural areas, with the most extreme rates in Palestine and Syria. It was higher in the rural areas because of the fact that the people had a very hard time of getting to hospitals or places with medical supplies to help them, because the rural areas were mostly hosting farmers and everybody who lived there who worked on the land. And because they were such a far away from the rural areas, like the farms, to the cities, that it was hard for them, because they were so sick, to get to hospitals and places with medical supplies to get healed. So there was such an impact of death in the rural areas due to that fact. And that was mostly Palestine and Syria, because Syria and Palestine have huge rural areas of farming. As we can see on the map, Syria is right next to the big green, which is Palestine. Palestine is mostly used for farming, except in Jerusalem, which is a huge city, but mostly in like Beersheba and Gaza, there's huge farming areas, and Syria also. Also, Gaza lost 10,000 people, along with Palestine, and Syria in total lost 400,000 people by the time the epidemic was over. So as we can see, the devastation in Syria was so bad that over 400,000 people were killed. Consequences. There were political, economic, and social consequences of the bubonic plague, which we will be learning about. Social effects. We will start with the social effects of the bubonic plague. First of all, lepers. Lepers are named for people with leprosy. People started to blame lepers for causing the spread of the disease. The people said that the lepers were poisoning the drinking water with their skin disease and caused it to spread to everybody else. Lepers were very mistreated back in those days. They were outsiders, and actually, in biblical times, they would take lepers and put them in caves and make them sit in caves and live there by themselves because the disease was so contagious and everybody was very prejudiced against them and viewed them as outsiders, and no one wanted to get sick from the disease. They were almost hated people. So lepers were very outcasts already in those times, and now that this disease came, lepers were the first people they started of accusing, and even went as far as accusing them of poisoning the drinking water and causing this disease. The lepers were persecuted and were pretty much exterminated throughout Europe. Also, anyone with a skin disease such as acne or a rash was captured and killed because everyone said that they were lepers. So even someone with an ordinary skin disease such as acne or just a rash would be killed because they were accused as lepers and thus accused of causing this disease. Another social effect was Jewish people. Jewish people were also persecuted and found and killed by the people during the plague. The attacks against the Jewish began in France, but were the most dramatic on Switzerland and Germany. Many of the Jewish people were rounded up and burned or drowned in marshes. The people were angry with the Jewish people because most of them were not infected with the plague. Jewish people were not allowed to eat the same meats as regular people because of their religion, and also they were separated by other villages because they lived in Jewish ghettos, because they were also persecuted and did not live with ordinary people. Therefore, many Jewish people did not have the plague because it did not spread to them, nor did they get it from the food because they did not eat those kind of meats. So many Jews were hated because of this. Because of this, another social effect was the eastward movement. The eastward movement was when the Jewish people who were left during the plague migrated to Poland or Russia to seek safety in hopes that they would not be found and killed. Religion also drastically changed. People thought that the plague was a wrath from God. People started to alienate the church and church officials and fear anything that had to do with religion. Economic effects. There are also many economic effects of the plague. The plague had begun during a recession that Europe had been going through since the beginning of the century, and thus this only worsened it. In Western Europe, the scarcity for cheap labor made landlords start to compete for peasants with wages and freedoms. Some say that the social upheaval of this competition ended up causing what was later the Renaissance and the Reformation, because all this upheaval of trying to get the slaves and the peasants to work for them caused these movements, these drastic movements. Other economic effects. Some good did come out of the plague, however. The plague had improved the lives of the surviving peasants. Due to the drastic decrease in the population, peasants had become more in demand, which gave them more power, and with the shortage of workers, gave them higher wages to work. There was also a rise in capital. There was a rise in capital because peasants were making a dramatic amount of more money, and the middle class started to rise. So therefore you have these peasants who are starting to make more money, they're starting to buy things, they're starting to produce more than they ever were able to because now they have more freedoms and they're more in demand, which gives them more power to make money, thus rises the capital of everybody around them. So with improved situations for peasants comes a rise in capital. Political consequences. There were a few political effects of the plague. King Alfonso of Castile was the only reigning monarch to actually die of the plague. However, many lesser nobles died, including the Queens of Aragon and France. The effect at the local levels was actually the most severe. City councils were destroyed, whole families of local nobles had been wiped out, and courts were forced to close down. Excuse me. Therefore, because of these local courts closing down, people who had made their wills, who had all who had passed away from this plague, the wills could not be carried out because there was no courts. There was no one to be in court. So actually, none of the family members who had been able to survive were able to benefit from the wills of their family to get things, because no wills could be carried out due to the lack of the court systems that had to be shut down. Also, political consequences. The most notable political effect and consequence was the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War was forced to be suspended in 1348. It was going on before the Bubonic Plague had kicked in, but because so many soldiers had died from the plague, there was almost no one left to fight. Therefore, it had to be suspended. The war was started up later, again, however. These are my citations, and that was my presentation. That's the Bubonic Plague. It was a very severe disease, and there was a lot of people who had been killed, but also there was good things, like we said before. We can't always focus on the bad things and the deceased, but we can also focus on good things such as the peasants and the raise of the economy, which turned out several years later to actually benefit people. So, thank you.